Hello, I'm Steve Halsey, one of your hosts of Building Brand Gravity. Did you know that a lack of funding and trust in journalism are two of the top concerns of journalists? This is followed closely by concerns about disinformation. These are some of the findings of the latest industry research by Muck Rack. Muck Rack is an all-in-one public relations management platform that was developed to help PR professionals better manage media relations, glean insights from more than 1,000 journalists, and just really allow them to be more effective at what they do. We're joined here today by Greg Galant, who is co-founder and CEO of Muck Rack, who's going to give us insights on these latest trends and take us into the world of media. It's going to be really exciting. We're going to be talking about how journalists works, how AI and social media are impacting what they do. And we're also going to talk about what does and doesn't work about pitching media in today's environment and much, much more. So, Greg, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thank you for having me on.
It's really exciting. You've been quite the entrepreneur, over your time, launching your first company at 14 years old, starting your first podcast out of college called Venture Voice, working with CNN you really took me back there. When we used to call it citizen journalism, that was pretty wild, looking at the broader trends as that came up. Helped launch a number of technology ventures. One of my favorite, the Shorty Awards. You were behind helping create that for social media. And of course, you changed the world a little bit in 2009 when you co-founded Muck Rack, and it's gone through a lot of iterations ever since. So can you tell us a little bit about the founding of Muck Rack, what was really kind of behind that? And then as part of that, how come you felt it's been important to publish this annual State of Journalism report for many years now?
Sure. So funny enough, it all started with podcasting. So when I started my podcast, interviewing entrepreneurs about how they got started in 2005, that was like the first, now that's a common format for a podcast. That was the first podcast of its kind. A lot of people don't know podcast comes from the iPod. At the time I was stuck in traffic, just got to my first iPod. I thought it'd be cool if people could download MP3s to the iPod that weren't music and you could hear.
Were you a Napster guy? Were you one of them?
Briefly, but probably
remember that whole thing about, oh my gosh, music sharing. So we went from Napster to.
I don't want to open myself up to any liability. But
yeah, that's probably smart. You just listen to Pandora now. That and Apple Music's probably smart.
That's right. Well, I think the statute of limitations are probably up on all of us.
So you were saying that a lot of this got started with your first podcast, and how that just opened your mind to thinking. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more.
That's right. So I thought, okay, let me experiment with this new podcast medium. Being an entrepreneur, I thought it'd be cool to just talk to other entrepreneurs and learn from them. And I got some amazing guests on. I had Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, back when LinkedIn still had just 50 employees, the founder of Yelp. I got John Bogle, the founder of the Vanguard Group and inventor of the Index Fund, just some amazing people to be able to interview and learn from. One of the people I had on my podcast was Ev Williams, who had this startup called Odeo, which is meant to be a podcast directory and discovery platform. Odeo never worked out, but I watched him pivot to a little side project that he had called Twitter. So that led me to sign up for Twitter way early. I got my first name on there, just @Gregory on Twitter, and still have it. And later got @Gregory on Instagram too, just by being the first one to sign up, at least with that name. And so kind of seeing that early social media world, this is around probably like 06 I signed up. And then, by 2008, I realized hey, there's no way to figure out who's worth paying attention to on social. So that led to the idea to launch the Shorty Awards along with my co-founder, Lee Semmel. And then after we saw that the Shorty Awards were really took off, and we got a ton of attention and press coverage, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, all reached out to us to cover it that first year. So we're like, oh, that's interesting. These journalists are using social media to figure out what to write about. They're all on social media. And there's so much just generally digital data about the journalists you could use to figure, to kind of get a sense of what's going on in the world. So that all led to the idea to launch the first version of Muck Rack in '09. And originally, actually, it wasn't for PR people. It was just for journalists. It's totally free. We launched it for journalists. We had over 10,000 journalist requests to get on there in the first year because they wanted to have profiles on the web. They wanted to have portfolios. They wanted to find each other. It was a public website, and I'd keep running into PR people who would all tell me like, "Oh, you do Muck Rack? Like, I love that website. I'm using it to figure out who I should pitch, who I should talk to, which journalists I should care about." So you realize like, oh, that's interesting. There seems like a great business opportunity here for this market that's kind of starved for data to know like who should they be talking to, how should they be reaching out to journalists. So that led us to relaunch Muck Rack in 2011. We kept it all free for journalists, and it still is today. But then we added the whole platform for the PR and corporate communications world to be able to log in, find the right journals to pitch, monitor the news, build reports, track the relationships, show how those journals' relationships impact the coverage that they get. And we've been on that journey ever since.
Wow. So a German idea, some serendipity, and here you are. And part of that is, I think one of the things that really differentiates what you're doing, and a lot of that goes to the original DNA, as you've just talked about, of really understanding what's on journalists' minds, what's in their world. And I'm assuming that's part of the reason why you've done this annual State of Journalism, what you're seeing, and some broader trends. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what was kind of the inspiration to really putting out to the world what journalists are seeing. And before we get into this year's study, have you seen any broader trends over the number of years you've been doing your annual report? Any particular changes in the way that journalists work or what they're looking for?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of, it's interesting, like a lot of things change, a lot of things stay the same. One of the things we found kind of consistently is that journalists are always looking for short, really tailored pitches, whereas I think a lot of people tend to sending out really, really long pitches. We've seen that's something that's remained constant over the years. But then on the flip side too, we see there are a lot of changes. It's a lot more concerned about the lack of funding and trust in journalism. We've about a third of journalists have major concerns there, and then a lot of new things coming out with how they're using newer social networks, how they're thinking about generative AI, et cetera.
Well, and one of the things I thought was interesting in your research that a lot of times we don't really think about, at least on the communicator's side of thing, is what the journalist's work environment was. I mean, when the pandemic hit, it fundamentally changed things for a lot of us, but not necessarily for journalists. I think when you look at some of the findings from your research, you had more than half of journalists say they only want to go into the office sometimes. Sounds fairly familiar. They're looking for hybrid work arrangements. Some want flexibility because they feel a little bit stuck in the office. And the thing that continues to be true today, as it always was journalism really isn't a 9-to-5 job. So before we get to talk about some of those other things, what are some of the challenges of the job? And with your research, why is that important to really delve and understand what the journalist's work environment is like?
Yeah, I think it matters a lot, especially, for a lot of those in corporate communications where it's, don't get me wrong, people in corporate communications are working all hours too, but, the construct of being at a large company, there's, you can get a feeling of a lot of stability and kind of more predictable HR policies and when you got to be in and what hours you got to work. Whereas for the journalists, it's very chaotic, where they're jumping around jobs a lot. A lot of them are, we're seeing a trend towards being freelancers too. And then even to your point, the ones that are at jobs, they're always switching around beats, what they're covering. They're in the office a lot less. So I think it changes up a lot of people's long time habits and strategies. For example, we see there are a lot of people who who grew up thinking, okay, I got to call the journalist desk line. And of course, if I call that journalist desk line between 9 to 5, they'll probably pick up. Now it's like, well, they're working from home half the time. Like they're probably not going to be at that desk line. So if you don't have their cell phone number, good luck. Or another we see is that people want to do the desk side tours where it's like, oh, hey, let me, come to your office and meet you. And they might be like, well, I live an hour from the office and I only want to go in once a week. So I'm not going to come in just to meet you there. So there are a lot of elements like that where we're seeing understanding, where journalism's going and how journalists are working really impacts how you think about building relationships with journalists.
Yeah, I've been in this profession for 30 plus years, so I guess I'm a bit of a dinosaur. And you took me back a little bit there in terms of time to call into the reporters. I mean, I remember my first agency job when we would call reporters, tell them we were going to send something. We would send it. We'd wait 3 to 5 days for the mail, and then we would call and say, "Did you get that? Great. Let's talk about setting up interviews." And it's been interesting to see how the pace of everything is compressed. I mean, news cycles have compressed, but the pace and the workloads, I think, was finding. I think one of the stats that you had in your research that I thought was interesting was nearly a quarter of journalists have to produce 11 or more stories a week. That is a lot of content that needs to be out there. And the finding also said that about 70%, I guess the number is 69%, say the work is primarily for online publications. How does this sheer number of stories, writing for digital and then back through print and others, how does that really impact the way journalists do their job and even just the way that legacy media thinks about its format?
Yeah, I think that real acceleration in the content volume that's expected of journalists changes a lot. If a journalist is making that much content, you really have to make it easy for them to get the story done. So we've seen a lot more focus on doing things like making sure you have all the photography and the media that would go along with the story ready, because a lot of times they're not going to be able to send out their own photographer like they could in the old days, or have the art department ready to do it. Another is organizing all the stats. Of course, another, and this is kind of an old basic, but just making sure that you have your spokespeople available and really fast turnaround to get journalists the information they need. And I think kind of along that thought process, the more you can kind of package up what the story is, the more powerful it is especially for a journalist with that kind of volume. And I should say too, I think it's important to research with any given journalist, how many articles does that journalist write by looking at their portfolio, because that dictates a lot. Because there are still some journalists out there that might be feature writers and they do, 1 or 2 stories a month. And the way you interact with that journalist is probably going to have to be completely different than how you interact with the journalist who's writing 3 or 4 stories a day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I mean, it was interesting. 64% based on your research, work more than 40 hours a week. About 36% reported layoffs or buyouts of their company. Salaries aren't the greatest in the world. So I guess part of the advice is we certainly have to have some empathy, because I've truly found that, most people that do journalism as a profession have a true love for the craft of what they're doing. And, we need to embrace and celebrate that in our communications with them.
Yeah, it's well said. It's, I guess low pay in journalism isn't necessarily anything new, but I think it's coming to a, much more challenging environment than before in terms of the layoffs and the lack of stability. So I think now more than ever, people going into journalism, it's a true calling. They're not doing it for the money. So I think that's a great point, that it's a good time to, reflect on that. And I think, obviously there's somewhat of an adversarial relationship inherent between journalists and communicators, but I think sometimes, when you're anytime you're pitching, you risk the challenge or the risk is like thinking only about everything from your own perspective, where it's like, why aren't they getting back to me? They owe me a response. I sent them this thoughtful pitch, but then just remember, like, hey, they're juggling a million things, and they're in this very unstable environment. And kind of, I think keeping that mindset and that attitude is good both for the journalist, because you'll be more, more empathetic and more helpful. But I think also good for the pitcher to not get discouraged and not take things personally that aren't meant to be personal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think if we were to put a little GIF in here right now to do that, I guess it would be like Jerry Maguire, help me, help you, right? Be cognizant about that. Well, we couldn't have a podcast, we couldn't have a discussion about comms and journalism without talking about AI, right? Those two letters, I guess I should say, are pretty much everywhere. And I thought there was some interesting things in your research, and in a lot of ways, I think journalism looking at the adoption from AI is similar to what we're seeing from a lot of other professionals in the communications industry. According to this year's Muck Rack's research, about 28% of journalists report using the technology. Another 20% plan to explore its uses. And there's definitely purists out there that says, no way, no how, I'm going to stick to the tried and true part of it. So tell me a little bit about what you're hearing about journalists' thought about generative AI, and then also the use of AI behind the scenes to kind of help put stories together and do the research.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I think it's always good to separate, like, there's the philosophical debate, is AI good for journalism or, good for society? And then there's the practical consideration, like, hey, it's here. It's one click away to anybody with an internet connection. And what do we do about it? So we've seen 20 in our survey, 28% of journalists report using AI, and 20% plan to explore it, which, to be honest, seems kind of low. And I imagine that number will tick up over time. Though we do see, I think when they say that, they're reading it in more to using it for writing, whereas 52% say they're using it for brainstorming, and similar number for research. So I think it's something where it's kind of like, the way I think about it as an analogy is like, before the spreadsheet came out, if you wanted to run a financial model, you had to do the math on every single cell yourself, and to do one, to change one variable in a financial model, you'd have to spend hours going through the rest. And then the spreadsheet came out. Now you can change a variable, and the rest calculates in a unnoticeable nanosecond. And kind of similar, I think with generative AI for writing, it gives you a lot to play with, where you could say, hey, I want to change the style of this, take this article I wrote, give me an idea on how I can cut it down from 1,000 words to 500 words, or help me translate it to the next language that we need to go after, or let me play with 50 different headline ideas. So I think there's some element where, use responsibly, and ultimately with the human reviewing it, you can just get a lot of leverage on your time, which I think could be a great thing for journalists who are strapped for time. And even, simpler uses of AI. Like, I was talking to a good friend of mine who's a journalist, and she was telling me that AI got her nights and weekends back, simply because for her stories, she has to do a lot of interviewing people on the phone. And she used to record it and then spend her nights and weekends manually transcribing those interviews. And now she has them all transcribed by AI. So she doesn't have to manually transcribe it at all. She can still go back and listen to the part she wants to quote to make sure the transcription was accurate, but not having to transcribe the whole thing. Just got her hours back in the day, and now she can choose if she wants to have more of a personal life or spend that time, working on more stories. So it's, I think there are a lot of powerful uses for it for anyone who's in a profession that involves a lot of writing and research, which journalists definitely fall into.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was surprising by your research, and I guess it's because Newsrooms are trying to figure this out, same as companies and college professors. But nearly 60% of the interviewees in this year's survey report that their newsroom has no AI use case policy, while only 24% have one. I mean, is that good? Is that bad? Does that mean we're enabling creative freedom? Does that just mean we really need to have a broader conversation about ethics of AI? Did that number shock you in this year's study?
Yeah, it did surprise me. I would have thought that more newsrooms would have a policy by now. Um, to be honest, I kind of have mixed. I could see it cut either way because, like, it definitely be better if 100% of newsrooms had a good AI use policy. But I think there's also a big risk in that if you do a bad AI use policy, it could be worse because then you restrict the judgment of the journalists, and you could either be too liberal in the policy and say, yeah, just use AI as much as possible, and then it might absolve the journalists of their own feeling of ethics and responsibility, and that like they should really review everything that the AI puts out and fact check it and a bunch of other obvious things. But I think there's also a risk to being too restrictive with AI because the thing is, like, it's here, everybody else has it, and there's definitely going to be bad actors, unethical people using AI to make a ton of content on the web, and that's already happening. So I think if the journalists aren't using AI, the good journalists out there aren't using AI to get more leverage to put out good, accurate, responsible content, but with more the extra leverage technology can bring, then they risk falling behind and letting the bad actors, dominate the conversation. So, I think like any other new technology, it can be used, wisely or poorly. And there's kind of responsibility in every profession, and particularly journalism, to not be too slow to adapt new technologies in smart ways to advance what their profession's meant to do.
Yeah, thinking about policies or not, I think is interesting, and then that got me in a little bit of a tangent when I heard you thinking. So picture this cage match: AI reporter versus human reporter. Who wins and why?
Yeah, I think with that, I think there'd be a third winner, the human who uses AI, because on one hand, the AI only reporter wouldn't have as much, wouldn't have the judgment, wouldn't have access to all the facts, can't just network and call up a source and do all the, or at least not yet, but do a lot of the work that is required to do good journalism. And I think also, part of what makes the journalism good is that someone trusts the person who writes it. So I think a lot of people would be suspect of what comes out from AI, even if it happened to be accurate. But then again, the journalist who today is not using AI would be wasting a lot of reps compared to the journalist who is using AI. So just for like that very simple example, let's say, you have journalist A, journalist B. Journalist A now has to spend 2 hours transcribing the interviews they did this morning. Journalist B has already used AI to transcribe them and is writing the story. Well, journalist B just scooped journalist A simply by having AI, transcribe for them, much less, maybe help brainstorm some headline ideas or do some proof checking or help them figure out which paragraph to cut. So I think, when you think of examples like that, it's clear that the person using AI is gonna beat the person not using AI. And there's a way they could do it, like in the example I gave, where you're probably not really sacrificing any quality and accuracy. That said, there's a risk you go too far using AI if you have journalist C who's like, you know what, I'm just going to have AI write the whole story. I'm going to spend 10 minutes looking it over for tone, and I'm going to publish it. Well, there's a good chance then journalist C publishes something that's totally inaccurate and they ruin their own credibility, or maybe open themselves up to libelous lawsuits. So, I think that middle road where it's like, how do you leverage the technology but not go overboard with it? Maybe an analogy would be if You can imagine when cars first came out, right? It's like, well, if you had the car and you had to go, get somewhere 50 miles away, you'll definitely beat the person with the horse or the runner. But, if you floor the car and you don't maintain it, like there's a good chance you'll crash on the way. And then the person on the horse or even somebody just walking will beat you because you'll be off repairing your car. So I think it's, it's finding that right way to use the technology to get to where you want to go.
I agree with you on that. I think that's a really good analogy. And then going back to my very poor cage analogy, the journalist leveraging AI, jumping in with the chair is going to dominate there. But I do agree it's a middle ground, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves because, like you were talking about the human perspective to curate, to bring different things together, at least at this point, to understand how to capture emotion in a way that AI doesn't, I think is going to be really compelling. That and then also I think, and particularly, with beat reporters or trade reporters, there's something innate in kind of their spidey senses that they pick up, having worked so deeply in these industries, having talked to so many different experts in the field. I think that becomes very, very hard when you get into a real granular level to do on an AI. You can get about 80% there, but it's a lot of times it's that final 15 to 20% that makes a difference between a good article and a great article. And I think that perspective really comes in. So part of your research also then looked at social media use, and you had that more than half of journalists say social media is important or very important in how they do their job. And X continues to dominate among journalists. Why do you think that's the case?
Network effects are really powerful. So you go somewhere where everyone else is, they're going to be there. There's some new place and you can't count on everyone being there. You don't have it. So I think there's a lot of journalists who are dissatisfied with X and it's being used relatively. We have seen a reduction in use compared to what it used to be in the days when it was called Twitter. But it's still by far the dominant platform. And as much as people have thought about going elsewhere, there's no clear other place to go. Some people have gone to Threads or Blue Sky, but it's not clear, like, is that the place to be? And there just aren't as many other people on there. So you write something there, it's not going to get as much engagement as it will on X for the most part. And I think there is a certain immediacy to X. Another thing is that other platforms, like they've seen having news on your platform from the perspective of a social network is a big headache, because no matter what you do, you're going to get accused of biasing, one side or the other with your algorithms, and someone will post something controversial, and then you have to decide if you want to take it down or not. And you have to, worry about a lot of advertisers who don't like the idea that, something might not be brand safe. Which unfortunately often means news. It's just hurt a lot of news publishers on their own websites, which is kind of collateral damage, I think, unfortunately. So in a way, it's like these other social networks, like, winning the news game, even if they could win it, it wouldn't serve their greater interest. Whereas X, FK, Twitter has always been all about the news, or at least that's been a big part of it, because it was the first social platform to have immediacy and just that instant access. And it just has such a history there that I think it's gonna, preserve its spot with that. And that's why we see, 81% of journalists plan to stay on X this year. So, regardless of what you think about it all, it's still where it's all happening.
Yeah. And I have a friend of mine who writes for the Chicago Tribune, and she was saying, hey, there's the immediate, and then there's kind of the accurate, right? And so platforms like Twitter, and my point is you want to be as accurate as possible, but that allows you to get that immediacy to get out there, to start getting ahead of the story. But then you've got the ability as you go into the longer form of content, into the online versions, and then ultimately the features, to start with a nugget of news and see how it comes out. But it's, I think we've seen time and time again, love Twitter or hate Twitter, when something's happening or breaking, where do people go first, right? Because that is that sense of immediacy that comes out. And then the ability to build stories after that, to adjust to correct facts as needed. And that's been really interesting to look at its effect on journalism and that as an opportunity. And your research showed other platforms, we don't want you to not feel the love. They go to LinkedIn, they look at other things. But I think when you were talking about, the network effect and really the immediacy of the feed, I think that's continued to give X a bit of an advantage. So why don't we switch a little bit and let's talk a little bit about the other side. Let's talk about the corporate communicators, the agency sides, how we interact. I think as we've talked so far, we've covered that, journalists are really strapped. They got to put a lot of stories out. They got a lot of pressure. They're trying to figure out where all these things come, how you mine this information. And then you get the endless glut, the sea of pitches, many may not even be relevant to the journalists coming in. So we're going to explore that in a little bit. But there was one stat I found fascinating from this year's study. It actually surprised me. So most journalists think that PR pros are important to their success. And I thought that, may be like a plurality or something like that. But 70% of journalists say PR pros are either important or very important to their success. Why is that, Greg?
Don't you feel the love?
Yeah.
It's I think it's a surprising stat to a lot because journalists are always complaining about how many pitches they get and PR pros. But I think it is, a reminder that deep down, like the journalists need sources, they need to get accurate info, and PR pros are their best friends for that. And we see a lot of journalists do leverage the PR community, both to get story ideas, because often those PR people are in the rooms where decisions are getting made and they see the trends before anybody else. And then also as stories are coming together, if there's a PR person in the mix, there's someone to quickly send the headshot and the bio and the, get the photo they need or dig up the stat that they need in a way that if you're only talking to executives at a company, you're going to be priority number 4 or 5 rather than priority number 1. So I think that should be heartening in that, as much as a lot of people find, hey, this pitch is getting ignored or it's hard to break through, it shows that if you do your job right, you'll be viewed as a real positive, as an asset. You're not just, just someone who's getting in someone else's way. And that shows, when you do it right, you can really excel and form deep relationships.
Yeah. And I think, again, one of the big topics that's really coming up as we talk today is like relevance. And so, I mean, for my corporate comms and agency brethren, that's an exciting staff. That 70% of journalists say they need us to help them do their job, to provide context, to give access to experts and those type of things. But yet the numbers are also high. When they get spammed, if you spam a journalist, you're gonna get ignored. About 49% say they respond to pitches seldom to never. So if you're not relevant, don't expect the courtesy, hey, thanks for sending me something that's completely off target. Despite low response rates, pitches still come in. You have 46% of journalists receive 6 or more pitches per day. That's more than 30 pitches per week. Probably for some reporters, they may get 30 pitches an hour for all I know. But the main reasons journalists reject pitches or don't give a response is if it's not relevant, if it's just a mass blast on something. So, Greg, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then maybe that becomes a good avenue for us to talk about how you guys work at Muck Rack to help make sure that those that are using the tool are being as relevant and useful as possible to journalists?
Yeah, we see that, when it comes to pitching, I think it's really essential to customize every single email you're sending out and look it over. The reason we started Muck Rack, one of them, when we launched the part for the PR community, we saw at the time, 10 plus years ago, the status quo is you just say, hey, I'm launching a tech product. Let me look up every tech journalist, send, an email to 500, 1,000 tech journalists. Here's a new tech product. And then, of course, tons of it's not relevant because someone might write only about B2B software and you're coming out with a consumer piece of hardware. Just a million other things where, if you spent a second on it, that journalist would never cover it. So that's where we're really big on figuring out, like, hey, look at what the journalist has actually written and tweeted about and otherwise created content on, and use that to figure out the right journalists to contact. And then instead of pitching 500 journalists, pitch 5 journalists in your first round. And if you're only pitching 5, you can put a tremendous amount of effort into each pitch, how to frame it, researching the journalists, connect with them on social, kind of go all out there. So I think that's a really powerful opportunity. And then we've been excited. We've been able to add on to that with AI now, where we launched this new feature with our media list. So if you have a media list, it'll suggest new journalists to add to that media list based on who's already on there. Kind of like if you used, going back to our earlier conversation about music, if you use Spotify, you set up a playlist and it says, hey, you got these 20 songs on the playlist. Here's a few more you might want to add based on those songs. It's that same concept. So it's like coming up with very targeted lists. But now I think with AI, we can also help you know, like, hey, who's maybe a couple people that you didn't think of that you should start thinking about too, to go after in a very curated way.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice. I mean, there's obviously those journalists you're going to have personal relationships with that, as long as you're giving them relevant information, are going to help. But there's other times when you're not going to have that existing relationship, and that relevance, I think, is key. And in some of your research, and again, I would recommend everybody go to www.muckrack.com. That's where you can find the latest research. Actually, you can find research for multiple years going back. You guys summed up kind of what you described as the elements of the perfect pitch. So let me just give a couple of those stats here, because I do think it's really important for that relevance. 83% of journalists to be pitched via one-on-one email. So while you want to put stuff out there on social and all of that, it's really about that personal connection of the one-on-one email. As we talked earlier, it's not a 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week job. So 64% of journalists don't care which day of the week they are pitched. And 22% prefer Monday, but it's not like the old schedule of here's your window, here's your time, here's your day. But people don't want to be pinged at 3:00 in the morning, their local time. And I stress that media relations is often global. Don't just use a US centric time zone view of the world. 44% want to receive pitches before noon on their time. They want us to be concise. 65% prefer pitches that are under 200 words. And don't wait an hour and be like, oh my gosh, Greg hasn't gotten back to me. Did he get it? Did he not get it? 51% of journalists say follow up is ideal. Really, when you're thinking about 3 to 7 days later. So to give me time to process this and come back when you're relevant. Anything else there on the perfect pitch, or again, how you guys have kind of perfected your own algorithm to help communications professionals not just find the right journalists, but kind of time their pitch, track coverage? How are you taking all of these insights and applying them into the tool?
Yeah, well, we've really focused on getting like the workflows just right. So figuring out, like, hey, if you have a whole bunch of journalists you might want to talk to, how do you narrow it down to just the right journalists? Then how do you tailor the the pitch to be perfect for each one. And that's where we really focused on having a workflow. So it's easy to start with your template of the facts you know you need to get out to everybody, but then have a view where you can see every journalist you want to pitch, customize exactly what you want to say to each person. While you're customizing it, having access to all the context on that journalist that you need to have, and then being able to connect that with your inbox, send it. Another key thing that we've really focused on too is building a CRM so that you can track all those conversations and make it available only to your team in an encrypted way, which is really powerful because we find what happens, especially now in the age of remote work. You have a in-house corporate comms team or a PR agency. Everybody's busy. Everyone's pitching all the time. And then, what happens, you don't realize that you're about to pitch someone that your colleague pitched 2 hours ago, and it's going to look unprofessional. Or, you're going to pitch someone cold, but it turns out your coworker knows that person really well. And if you'd only known, you'd have been much better off getting a friendly intro. So by having that shared source of knowledge in the CRM, we really help our customers know hey, what's the total context on this relationship versus just thinking of each pitch as its own transaction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So as you make life easier for journalists by managing the flow, bringing their spam down, do you get a lot of really good birthday presents as hey, Greg, thanks for getting my pitches a little more focused to me?
Yeah, I don't know how many of our customers know my birthday, but it is a treat whenever I go to an industry conference and I meet some people who've been using the software. I've gotten a lot of people who just say, "Hey, the tech we've done is giving them their Friday back because they used to have to do a ton of copy and pasting, and now we do it, or it got them a raise or a promotion because they got that article that they want." And for me, that's always the most gratifying part because I can look at we have lots of usage data, and I can look at the aggregate stats on how many tens of thousands of people are logging in every day and how active they are. But that never compares to just meeting an actual human one-on-one where our software has helped. So for me, that's always the most motivating part of the job.
Yeah, it's and again, I think what's so fascinating and powerful, and why you guys have seen so much growth in your model is that it's been grounded in kind of like, even though it's serving the PR community, it's really grounded in journalists first kind of mindset, which I think is really important. And you talked about the workflows and the process. Maybe we can talk about AI in a little bit different way before we wrap here. Not generative AI, but machine learning and how you've tapped that at Muck Rack. I mean, can you explain for our listeners a little bit what is the nuance between machine learning and generative AI, and how does that help you continue to one, better serve journalists and PR professionals, but just continue to innovate and evolve as Muck Rack?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's important to go into a language on it all. Where AI is a very general term. It encompasses both. One type of AI is machine learning. Another type of AI is generative AI. And we've been using machine learning for almost since the inception of Muck Rack, well over a decade. We're 15 years old now, to do things like analyze articles, figure out who wrote the article, is the sentiment positive or negative, when the article is written. And a lot of this stuff sounds simple, but when you apply it, we are processing millions of articles every day. Some we get in structured formats from licensing deals we have, and special data pipes we have from publishers. But some of the content might just be some blog that started a week ago, and we have to our technology needs to figure out what's going on there in a very unstructured way. So we brought machine learning to bear for a long time to solve those problems for our customers. And then more recently, in the last year, we've added a lot of generative AI functionality with PressPal AI. We just launched our AI-powered word clouds this week so that customers can put together really advanced word clouds in real time on all the coverage that they're getting. And that's where, both, using this combination of machine learning in some cases, generative AI in another case, can really push this whole profession forward. And we're excited about the role we have to play in it.
Oh, I love me a good word cloud. I'm glad that you guys are improving that because, as simple as it sounds, if you get the algorithm right to pop things like that, it really does tell a really powerful story in terms of what you're looking at and seeing. So that's great. Kind of the application of machine learning and just the continued iteration that you've done since 2009 has been amazing. One last question before we kind of wrap here, Greg. So, I forgot to point out earlier, the research that you did was global. It's not just U.S. based. You travel quite a lot globally, meeting with members of the industry, members of the media. Maybe you can offer a little bit of a different perspective. Are the trends that we're seeing here in North America, are you seeing very similar things globally, or are you hearing anything different as you talk to communicators and journalists around the globe?
I think the trends are global. That said, I think a lot of stuff happens first here before at least it gets to the UK and Europe. So sometimes you can kind of see a bit of despair, and sometimes it goes the other way too. So I think the old line, I think it was Azimuth who said it, like the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, is definitely true with journalism and PR too, that you can look to some countries and see they push further ahead with digital, whereas others haven't as much, which I think is a great reason to travel and to run global enterprises and to connect with colleagues in other countries, because we got lots of great ideas, both some ideas that might push you forward and be like, oh, they're trying that there, we should try that here too. And sometimes other times we're like, oh wait, we're trying this thing here, but we can't count on somebody in another country already being as far along with that. So we're going to have to slow down in that market and figure it out. So it's always just something I find really, really fascinating. And the fun thing about PR and journalism is that you're global, whether or not you want to be, because you might be a company that only operates in one city in the US, but if somebody writes about you who's based in London, or even on the other side of the world in Australia, your next door neighbor might see that article and not come to your store, or decide to come to your store because of that. So there's this element where you no matter, even if you're a neighborhood coffee shop, you kind of have to worry about the global media environment, because things can travel from one end of the world to another in a millisecond.
Yeah, that is so true. So this has been an absolute fascinating discussion. I would invite all of our listeners to again visit muckrack.com, where you can learn more about the platform. In their resources, you've got all the research. I'd also encourage you to reach out to Greg. He travels the globe. He's talking to everybody, and if you find him on social media, he tends to be first name on a lot of these platforms. So he's easy to find from that standpoint. And, as we think about our discussion here today, I mean, it really starts with bringing a journalist's first point of view. Greg, as you talked about just the founding of Muck Rack and what's been so powerful is starting with that journalist point of view, understanding what their workload is, what their need, what their challenge is, having a little bit of empathy. We had a great discussion about the cage match, AI reporter versus human reporter. And I think our answer is kind of the cyborg hybrid of both is probably, one of the strongest there. And we talked about the importance of X still being a big news source from the network effect. And then we talked about really the importance of having a tailored, timely pitch that's relevant, and how you can use something like Muck Rack to make sure you're being really relevant. What did I miss, Greg? Any final thoughts before we close here? Any words of advice to the comms professionals out there?
I think that's a great summary. I'd say just check out the full report, come to muckrack.com, and you can all read it for yourself. And we're always coming out with new features, so keep watching the space.
Greg, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm always inspired to see what it is that you're coming up next. I could talk to you for hours about those type of things. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Drop us a line with your thoughts on today's episode and check back soon for the latest episodes of Building Brand Gravity. I'm Steve Halsey, your host. Thank you for joining me. And Greg, thanks again for joining Building Brand Gravity.